Hello, we are back to talk more about GUI applications and give you some more tips and examples to help you get some practice and get more comfortable with them. Now, the first thing I want to do is show you um, opening code that was previously created. So in the previous video, we created some code that we called first GUI, but I failed to go and show you what that looks like in Windows Explorer, where and how it was saved, and want to make sure that once you close out Visual Studio that you're comfortable with going back and opening back up your code that you previously created. I also want to show you a little tip about zipping and unzipping folders. It's pretty common. A lot of you probably already know how to do it, but some of you may not, so I want to make sure that you know how to do it. Because the code that I will be posting will be in a zipped folder, so I want to make sure that you can access that code. And then when you submit your folders, you'll submit it in a zip folder. So just want to make sure everyone's very comfortable and in the habit of doing that to open and close their code files. So in the last video, I created one called First GUI. And then I zipped the folder and posted it to the course website. So if you were to try and download that code, you would get a zipped folder like this, and you'd want to right-click and choose Extract All, and click Extract. And then it will show the folder not zipped. I'm going to go ahead and delete the zipped folder. And now if you want to open back up that code, what you want to do is open the folder and find the .sln, the Microsoft Visual Studio solution file. And if you double click on that, and it should open in Visual Studio. Oops, loading. I suppose I don't have to wait for it to load. Oh, but I did want to show you. Okay, when it opens up, it might not open up the form that you're used to seeing. So if you don't see it, you can go over and find the name of the form and double click on it. And that should open back up your form in the designer mode. So this is the application we created in the previous video. Now, when you're done, you can go to File, Close Solution, and then you can find the folder where it saved all those files, and you can choose Send to Compressed Zipped Folder, and that is how you can submit your work. Okay, now I did want to note, and don't mind that the example code here on the slide is a little more complex than what we're used to. I did want to note, though, that if values change based on user input, the variable that you have should be stored outside of any method that reacts to the user's event. So basically what that's saying is if you want to save some number, let's say, and you want it to change every time the user clicks on the button, then you don't want to create that variable inside of the button method, because otherwise every time the user clicks on the button, it will start over from scratch. And I'll show you what I mean by that in an example. we're going to do two examples. First is the number countdown, and that's where I'm going to show you an example of the concept I just explained on the previous slide. And then we'll do another example so that we can get some extra practice using the string length property and maybe the substring method. Just getting more practice, but now doing our examples in GUIs instead of text-based. All right, so I'm going to jump back to Visual Studio. And I'm going to create a new project, a Windows Forms app. I'm going to call this one Countdown, and I'm going to save it in my desktop code folder. Okay. So if we jump back to my code folder, you can see that now it's created that folder with some subfolders and a solution file. Okay, in this new application, which I've called Countdown, I'm going to do an application where we start with a number. So let's put a label on our form. And let's have the text of this label say, well, let's just have it start with the number 10. Now, the name of this label is label 1. But what I wanted to mention is that it's good practice to rename your controls so that they aren't just named label 1, text box 1, button 1, and so forth. So you can use the name property to change the names of a form or any control on a form. And you should use the same conventions that you use when you're naming any other variable. So use camel casing, start with a lowercase letter, and it's good practice to use the type of object in the name. So for example, here, instead of calling this label 1, I'm going to find the name property. They changed something in the latest version. Oh, here it is. Okay. So it's actually at the top. They put it in parentheses. So in your alphabetical list of properties, it's near the top. Okay. So this doesn't actually change what anything visually looks like. This is just the variable name that you see in C#. So instead of label 1, I'm going to call this my number label. So the convention usually is to have some sort of description of what that label is, followed by the word label. And if it's a text box, similar thing, but a description of what the text box is about, followed by the word text box. So then when we refer to this label in the actual C# code, we'll refer to it as number label instead of label 1. Now let's also add a button to our form. And instead of calling this button 1, we're going to change it by going to the name property, and I'm going to call it countdown button. And for the text property, I'm going to change button 1 to countdown exclamation point. So what this program is going to do, very simple. It's going to start at the number 10. Every time we click the button, it's going to count down from the number 10. Now, let's double click on the button to generate our button click method. So here it's called countdown button underscore click. Now I will note here, we changed the name of the button before we created the click method, which is best practice. If we happen to have created the method and then we go back and change the button name later, so let's say I wanted to change this, maybe I thought countdown button was too long, I just want it to be called CD button for countdown button. Now if I go back to my code, this is still called countdown button click method, which could get confusing. So what I'd want to do in this case is select it and right click and choose rename and then choose apply. So you don't want to just change, you don't want to just come here and change the name to CD button click, because that could cause problems, because there's other background code that we're not seeing that refers to this method. So if you just come here and change the name of it, that's going to totally mess up your application and it's going to screw everything up. So if you need to rename a method, don't just come in here and change it. You need to right click on it and then go to rename. And I'm zoomed in too far. Now we can change the name to CD button click, and then we'll click apply. Okay, and I have some slides, or a slide to remind you of that. Another similar problem that sometimes students run into is maybe they accidentally double click on the button again. Oh, it looks like they've corrected this in the latest version of Visual Studio. Okay, so let's say another problem that you might want to figure out the answer to is if you accidentally double click on a label and it creates this method called number label click. Okay, we don't really need to put some code in the label because we don't necessarily want anything to happen when the user clicks on that label. So instead of just deleting this method, again, these methods are very touchy. So the headers of these methods, you don't want to change anything manually, right? Don't change the keywords preceding the method name. Don't change the parameters inside of the parentheses until you become more expert. Don't just willy-nilly change the name. You got to right click and choose rename. And even if you want to delete a method, don't just highlight and delete it. What you want to do is go back to your designer view, click on the control that is associated with that method that you want to delete. Come over here to the properties label, and here there's an icon that looks like a lightning bolt. If you hover over it, it says events, and then it has a list of events, event methods that were created for that. So here you'll find there's a click method called number label click. You can just delete that out and hit enter. And then if you go back to your code, you'll find that that method is gone. Okay, so I have some reminders in the slides if you want to download the slides. Okay, and then just some other kind of hints and tips for you to refer to. Correcting errors, I'm sure you'll see this as we go along and I show you some examples. I'll do some errors, some purposeful, some not, and I'll show you kind of how Visual Studio handles those. And then at the end, I put a link, the end of this slide, I put a link to Microsoft C# online library. So it's basically their online help function for C#, so you can refer back to that. All right, so now let me go back to my example, and let's actually build our application now. Okay, so we've got a label that has a number, and we've got a button that every time we push the button, we want this number to count down from 10. Okay, so how might we do that? Well, the first thing we might want to do is create a variable that holds the number, and then we can count down that variable. So I've created an integer variable. I've called it num, and I've assigned it a value of 10. Okay. So every time the user clicks the button, I want to decrease that number by 1. So if you'll recall, in chapter 2, we talked about the pre and postfix incrementers. So if I do num minus minus, what that is doing is it's taking the value that is held in this variable and decreasing it by 1. Now after I've decreased it by 1, counted down, I can put the number back in the label. Or not put it back, but display the number in the label. Okay, so it just starts by default. I hard-coded the number 10 to be the initial value of that label. But then when the user clicks the button, that label, which I called number label dot text, the text property of that number label will be assigned the value of my num variable. Right? It's the number that I've been decreasing by 1 each time the button is clicked. But this has to be a string, and this is currently an integer, so I have to convert that to a string. Now let's test that out. Click debug, start without debugging. I purposely made a mistake. Maybe you've caught it. And here we go. Here is our countdown. So we press countdown, and it counts down to 9. And what happens if we press the button again? Nothing. No matter how many times we press it, the label will always show 9. And the reason that is because every time we click the button, this number starts over at 10. So this is the concept I was referring to earlier. Sometimes it's better to declare or initialize your variables outside of your click method, and that's totally fine. You can add some code here, like right above your click method. So if we cut and paste that line of code, now what happens is this integer variable is created when the user opens up the application instead of when they click on the button. So the user opens up the application, this number variable is created and starts at 10, and then when they click on the button, then that number is decreased by 1, and then the new value of that num variable is converted to a string and displayed in a label. Okay. With the code how we had it before, Every time we click the button, num would reset to 10 and then decrease by 1 and then show on the label as 9. So no matter how many times we click on the button, it would show the number 9. But now by initializing this variable outside of the click method, we don't start over from scratch every time we click the button. Now when we click the button, we just decrease the number and display the number on the screen. So let me test that again. That's better. Okay. So that's a pretty straightforward application. Let's build one more example application. So I closed that solution. Now I'm going to start a new project, a Windows Forms app. I'm going to name it Name Letters. It's an application where we're going to let the user input their name, and then we are going to count the number of letters in their name. And I'm going to make sure this saves to my, oh, that was already selected, my desktop code folder. Okay, so we start with a new form. I'm going to add a text box to this form, a label, a second label, and a button. Okay, label 1. So I'm going to change the names of these to be more helpful. Label 1, I'm going to actually, I don't care if the name of that is label 1 because label 1 I'm not going to be changing at any time. It's always going to say the same thing. In the text property, I'm going to put, it's just an instruction to the user. So oftentimes when it's just, I'm leaving an instruction for the user, I don't change the name of it. Maybe it might be best practice to do so, but there's not really a need because we're not going to be referring to it in the code. I'm going to have it say, please enter your name, colon, and hit enter. The text box I am going to rename. You'll see that the text property of a text box generally is empty because you usually don't have the text box start with some value in it. The name property, I'm going to change it so it's not text box 1. I'm going to have it be name text box. So it's the text box where people put their name. Hit enter. The button, I'm going to rename it as the OK button. And for the text, I'm going to have the button say OK. And then label 2, I'm going to rename it as the result label. And the text, I'm going to delete out the text and have it start blank. Okay, so now I've got my controls on there. I've got them renamed how I want them, got their default text how I want it. Now, at this point in time, I'm going to double click the OK button, which will generate the OK button click method. And now what I'm going to do is count the number of letters in a person's name and tell them in the label how many letters it is. Actually, let's jump back to designer code. I've changed my mind. For this label, I want the default text to not be blank. I want the default text to be number of letters in your name, colon, space. And then when the user presses OK, I want the number to appear after that text. Okay, jumping back to the code view. All right, so the first thing that I want to do in my code is collect the input from the user. So the user puts their name into this text box. And if I don't remember what I renamed the text box, I can come back to design view, click on it. Oh yeah, I renamed it name text box. Okay. So whatever the user input is going to be stored in the text property of that text box. Okay. So I'm going to save that to a string variable. I'll call it name. And then, okay, so I've saved the user's name into a string variable, which I have called name. Now what I want to do is tell the user how many letters. Right. Well, if you recall from the Chapter 2 video lectures and from the textbook, you can count how many characters are in a string variable by using the length method. So if we use the name of our variable, which in this case is name, sorry if that's confusing, we can type dot length. That will give us how many characters are in the name that the user input. Okay, so what are we going to actually do with that number? Well, we're going to put it back in the label. So we're going to assign that to the text property of the result label. And again, if you don't remember what you renamed that label, what that label is called, you can go back to your design view, click on the label. It was result label. So we want the text of that label to be number of letters in your name, colon, space, and then we are going to concatenate that with the actual number that we counted, the number of characters in that variable. Let me zoom out just a little so if you're following along, you can see the whole line of code. So the label text is going to be set to this literal string plus this literal string. Let's test that out and see if it works the way that I would expect it to. Okay, it asks us to input a name. So I'll enter my name. Now I will press OK. And it says that the number of letters in my name is 6, which is correct. Now if I type a different name, like Bob, should say the number of your letters in your name is 3. All right. Now if we close that out and go back to our code, I want to show you another thing that might be useful, which is what if after the user has input something, we want to add a button that clears the text box and resets our label. So let's add a button to our form. Let's put it next to OK. Oops. And we don't want it to be called button 1. Let's call it the clear button. And the text that it should show on the button is the word clear. What we want is that when the user presses this button, whatever the user previously input in the text box, we want it to disappear. And we want this label to reset to its original text, which is number of letters in your name with nothing after the colon. So we can double click on the clear button, and now we can add some code inside of this method. So however many buttons you add to your form, that's how many different methods, button click methods, button click event methods that you will have in your code. So here, if we would like to clear the text box, all we have to do is set that text box, which we had renamed to name text box, set the text property of that to be what we call an empty string. So I just did an opening and closing quotation mark, and what that means is it's an empty string. It's a string that has no characters in it. So when the user clicks on the click button, the text property of that text box will be set to nothing or blank. So let's test that out. So if I enter my name and press OK, it counts the number of letters in my name. And then if I click clear, then the text box text is set to be blank. Now I can also reset the label. Similarly, I'll name the label, refer to the text property, and set that to be number of letters in your name with nothing else appended to it. So now if I type in Bob and click OK, it counts the number of letters in his name. I click clear, those things disappear. All right, I will post the code for both of these examples on the course website. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.